Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program on the UVA Chapel, Marrying the Past, Present, and Future. My name is Woody Wingfield. I'm with the University Advancement Office representing University Priorities, and I'm very excited to welcome so many of you this evening. I'm going to be your moderator, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you to all who shared their stunning wedding day photos from the UVA Chapel. We're so delighted that so many of you could share a memory or two from that special day. I know personally I'm looking forward to the day when white tuxedos make a comeback. I'm holding out hope. A couple of housekeeping reminders for the event. As you saw, we are recording. Closed captioning for this event is available. And we will have a Q&A question and answer session later this evening. We invite you to submit questions throughout the event using the Q&A feature, and we're going to get to as many as we can. I'd like to now bring on our panelists for the evening, Brian Hogg and Sarita Herman. Brian Hogg shares responsibility for development of guidelines for the renovation and maintenance of Mr. Jefferson's academical village, and for numerous historic facilities studied in the 2007 UVA Historic Preservation Framework Plan. He has oversight of all historic structure reports and of capital projects associated with adaptive reuse of historic buildings. He has participated in the renovations of Garrett Hall, New Cabell Hall, and most of the Jefferson designed buildings near the lawn. His recent projects include the renovation of the Rotunda, adaptive reuse of the Rugby Road faculty apartments as a university office building, and the historic structure reports from Pavilion 8 and McGuffey Cottage. He has a BA in art history and French from the University of Virginia and an MS in historic preservation from Columbia University. Welcome, Brian. Sarita Herman is a historic preservation project manager at UVA. She received her master's degree in architectural history from UVA in 2010. Some of her notable projects include the renovation of the Rotunda, UVA's memorial to enslaved laborers. She received UVA's Outstanding Faculty Speaker Award from the Office of Engagement in 2020 for her work engaging the public during construction of the UVA Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. Sarita is also on the board of directors for the Ivy Creek Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Hogg and Sarita Herman.
Oh, thank you, Woody. I'll start with a little bit of background as to how we ended up with the chapel at the university. And then Sarita will talk to you a bit about the work that we're planning. So if we could go to the first slide, Sarita. Having a chapel at UVA was an issue starting while Thomas Jefferson was still alive, while the university was being constructed. There was a lot of pressure from the legislature, from people who didn't understand Jefferson's idea that this would be a secular university rather than one affiliated with any denomination. And Jefferson's concession to that pressure, in part to keep the money flowing, was to allow services to be held on Sunday in the Upper East Oval Room, what you would now recognize as the Board of Visitors Room. By 1845, the two south wings of the rotunda were enclosed and made into space, and the east wing was dedicated as the chapel, or given over to use as the chapel. And the little inset from the larger map you see on the right-hand side, just below the drum of the rotunda, it's labeled as the chapel. This map is from the late 1870s. And you can see where the chapel would go eventually in the left, opposite Brooks Hall, where Sarita is pointing, thank you. However different the chapel looks from all the other Jefferson buildings, it sits on the grid that Jefferson established for the lawn. Its front door lines up perfectly with the front door of Hotel A. And if you imagine the rotunda with the annex in place, it worked together with Brooks Hall to create a very pleasing composition on the north side of the lawn, which didn't matter so much in 1823, but by 1883 had become a major entrance and a major face of the university to the public. A lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today, I should give credit to David Dashiell, who wrote a master's thesis in 1992 on the creation of the chapel, and to the historic structure report for the building that Quinn Evans did for us a few years ago. If we could have the next slide. The current chapel was not the first chapel contemplated. They started in 1835, only 9 years after Jefferson's death, planning a Gothic chapel that would go on the south end of the lawn, sort of for conversation's sake, where Old Cabell Hall is now. What you're seeing now is an illustration of a chapel that was proposed in the 1850s by William Pratt, who was the first superintendent of buildings and grounds. And it too would have gone in the middle of the lawn, blocking the view to the south. This is a photograph of a receipt for someone who made a contribution to the fund that would have paid for the chapel. The Civil War put an end to this particular effort. It's important to look at this, though, and see how large a building they were contemplating. The center section seated 700 people, and each of the side wings had space for 400. The current chapel is about 200 people. So they were really ambitious in their planning for a chapel before the war. The next slide, please. The current chapel was designed by Charles Cassell, who was a Portsmouth native and a UVA alum. He graduated from the School of Engineering at age 15 and began a career as an engineer, a very wide-ranging career as an engineer and an architect, and quite a colorful life. His practice was mainly in Baltimore, although he worked up and down the mid-Atlantic coast. His nephew had a practice in Norfolk, and he was there for a while. Ecclesiastical work was a large portion of Cassell's practice. Roughly a third of his buildings are churches of some sort. If you're from the Central Virginia region, you may know Trinity Church in Stanton. He was the architect for that building. How he was selected is not entirely clear. The chapel, like Brooks Hall and like the observatory, was a turnkey gift to the university. Most of the fundraising was done by the Ladies Chapel Aid Society, who came up with the slightly over $15,000 that were needed to build the building. UVA provided the site. And this was part of a larger trend in Southern universities after the Civil War, where people made gifts to the school in an effort to get them back on their feet and reestablish them as robust institutions. The other two buildings we got were academic. This is more of a spiritual one. Because of the way that the university received the building, we don't really have any drawings for it, nor do we know of an archive of Cassell's work. There's a written description of the drawings from the 1880s, but no drawings themselves. Of course, one of the constant questions is, how did this Gothic building end up at UVA? As I mentioned, it's cited in a very UVA way, but the architectural expression is not. And partly it was because Gothic meant Christian. Gothic was the architecture for churches, and stone was the way to build important public Gothic buildings. If you go to the next slide, and I won't make you read all of it, I'm sorry there are so many words on it. This is from the dedication of the cornerstone by Maximilian Schell de Vere, who lived in Pavilion 4 at the time. And it's a 9-page brochure from his speech at the cornerstone. Basically, he's describing Jefferson's buildings as the pagan temples, which are perfect for the searching for truth on earth, man's knowledge, where the Gothic, with their pointed arches gesturing toward heaven, is the expression, appropriate expression for a building, a Christian building. And the references to nature are particularly interesting and appropriate. So you go to the next slide. This is a picture of the chapel taken from the rotunda scaffold while the building was being restored after the fire in 1895, looking west. And you see the entire Lewis Mountain neighborhood and everything west of town was still a farm. There were no academic buildings very close to it. The anatomical theater was probably the closest one. So it really gave the impression of being a little country parish church, which in many ways it was when it was opened in 1890. The next slide. This is the only historic image that we have of the interior of the chapel. We think it's from shortly after the building was finished. So it shows us something, notably that the building is remarkably intact from the time that it was finished. It has changed very little. In this picture, the organ keyboard has been, since this picture was taken, the organ keyboard has been removed and the organ was replaced in the 1950s, early 1950s, which was the last really major renovation of the building. You see some of the stained glass windows are in place. Most of them are contemporary with the construction of the building. They were done by Lamb Studios in New York, who were, if not exactly competitors to Tiffany, they were very respectable respectable and well-known stained glass studio. There is one small Tiffany window in the east transept, a memorial to a young woman. On the windows on the south end, which we saw briefly in the slideshow, the very vividly colored geometric windows are also original and are particularly beautiful with the afternoon light coming through them. And the windows that were changed were the nave windows, and those were made as gifts and memorial gifts over the course of mostly the 19th century, although the most recent of those was put in 1978. And there are no more spaces. All of the geometric windows have been removed. So the nave is now complete as well. So this little Gothic building, which seems so out of place, was really quite consciously designed for the university, contrary to the many stories that you may have heard about the drawings being switched or being sent to the wrong drawings being sent to UVA and things. And actually, when it was finished, it was very well received and it was well loved from the time it opened until today. And so mention quickly that you see the altar furniture is there, and we still have all of the altar furniture as well. The last slide that I have before turning it over to Sarita is a review from the University magazine, which is a very favorable one from 1885, while the building is still under construction. So Sarita will tell you how we can try to put it back together.
Thank you, Brian. So I'll take you into the contemporary era. I showed you this slide to point out kind of the thinking that has gone into planning this project and how the chapel is used today. And I'm not going to read to you all of the events that take place in the chapel over the course of the year, but you can see that in 2018, although there are still lots of midday services and religious affiliated organizations using this building, many of the uses for the building today are truly academic and extracurricular uses by the students of the university. And so we actually spoke with the students quite a bit in programming this interior restoration to talk to them about what they needed in the building. And you can also see that it's quite heavily used. So starting off with some of the problems of repair that have driven the motivation for doing an interior restoration and some exterior maintenance work. Of course, like any historic building, the enemy of the chapel is moisture. And we do have moisture coming into the building in a couple of different ways. You can see in this photo of the stained glass windows, there's bubbling on the window frame, and that's from moisture coming through the masonry walls and getting into the plaster behind the paint. And then in this photo, this is a picture of the basement of the chapel. And what you see here, this flat rock ledge is actually native rock that the chapel was built on. When they were excavating the chapel foundations, they hit rock, and rather than remove it, they just built the chapel stone walls right on top of it. And it has created some real moisture problems over the years. This dock is running water, actively running water that comes into the building during any heavy rainstorm. And so really resolving these moisture issues is step one. And the university is taking on making repairs to the building right now to resolve these moisture issues. So our maintenance reserve funds have committed a significant amount of funding to fix these moisture issues before we take on an interior restoration. And that's so that when we do all of our interior finish restoration, it's not immediately damaged by moisture intrusion. So this photo is a current photo from this past fall, and it's all the scaffolding that we've had to put up around the building to give masons access to repoint the exterior. They're doing a fairly comprehensive repointing. There has been some repointing done. There was previously a pretty extensive repointing of the bell tower done, but the building hasn't had a comprehensive repointing in a very long time. This is our historic preservation mason, Dennis Edwards, working on removing some aged mortar so that he can restore the mortar joints. And then the other thing that we're doing is, as I mentioned, the water intrusion in the basement is a real issue. And so what we'll be doing is excavating around the foundations to install a pretty robust waterproofing and drainage system around the edges of the building where we have issues. We're not doing it around the entire building. So some of the places around the building are very difficult to get to, and we're not seeing a lot of moisture intrusion around the whole building. So we'll just be waterproofing the critical areas. And that will take place this spring and summer before any interior restoration happens. So the interior improvements that are planned, this is the scope of work. The biggest items that will make the biggest changes to the interior of the chapel are the lighting replacement and restoration of all of the historic finishes, which includes woodwork, red washed brick, brownstone, and Aberdeen granite. And some possible additional scope includes replacing that organ that Brian talked about, which, as he mentioned, is already a replacement organ, so that it can be playable, because many of the users of the chapel are actually students in our music department who play the organ. So these are some of the interior problems of repair. As Brian mentioned, the building was last renovated in the 1950s, and these issues are a result of the building not having been renovated in a very long time. You can see one of our biggest issues is lighting. These are replacement light fixtures, not in the original location of the original light fixtures, but in a lower location. And you can see we still have the original wiring from the 1950s, which is a plug draped over this brownstone block and plugged into the wall next to the light fixture. And we do believe that these are light fixtures from the 1950s. And then a cork floor that is also quite worn. We've lost lots of cork tiles over the years, and so we have mismatched cork, and it's in very poor condition. Underneath that cork, we do have hardwood, so we'll be looking to restore it. And you can also see the wainscoting in this photo is quite damaged. I'll also mention that all of my photos of the contemporary chapel are using very bright flash photography, because the chapel is incredibly dimly lit. And that's really kind of by design. It's supposed to be this sort of quiet, reserved, dark, contemplative space. And you can see that the original lighting, it was installed at a different location than the current light fixtures, which are installed at the bottom of these arches, which is off screen in this one very early photo that we have of the chapel. But if you zoom in to the top corner of this photo, you can see that the maidenhead detail, which I'll show you a picture of the maidenhead in a moment, just below the maidenhead detail, at the top of these arches, the light fixture came out and hung, and we can still see a penetration in the woodwork where these light fixtures, cabling for these light fixtures would have come down. We're not sure that this is an original photo, but it's certainly it's the earliest photo we have of the chapel. It does not have a date. So here again, you can see the light fixtures, and you can see the maidenheads top of these arches. And we would like to relocate the lighting in the chapel back to the original or early location below the maidenhead, And what that will achieve is bring the lighting out towards the middle of the pews, which will put the light where it needs to be, where people can, to make it easier to read while you're sitting in the pews. And in this photo, you can also see, this is a artificially brightened photo of the chapel, so that you can see the contrast between the darkness of the woodwork. And the best place to look for original looking wood finishes in the interior of the chapel is the furniture at the chancel, as Brian mentioned, is original. And you can see how much brighter it is than the wainscoting behind it. And we've done some research to show that the original wainscoting, all of the wood trim and all of the stone and brick finishes would have been, similar bright reddish tone to this furniture, as well as the organ surround, which is also original and has not had as much damage, later interventions done to the finish, so it's still fairly original in appearance. This is just a quick shot of that lighting scheme where we plan to move some very simple pendant lights. Since we don't know that the early photo we have is even an original photo, we're going to do just a really simple transitional fixture. We're also going to increase the light levels in the building by adding LED strip lighting to the horizontal members of the ceiling. And that will just provide a really low-key wash of light that gets all the way up to the ceiling, so that we can gently light the ceiling without blowing out the brightness of the room, but allow people to get a better sense of the architecture. This is actually that hardwood flooring that we found underneath the cork flooring. It's still there. It's a beautiful pine flooring. It has never been refinished, so it's in great condition. And we very much look forward to removing the cork and plywood that are layered over top of the original pine, so that you can see those beautiful floors. Some of them have been replaced because there was a fire in the chapel at one point, but some of them are original. These are photos of the interior finish investigation that we had done in the summer of 2019. Here you can really see that beautiful wood finish on the organ surround and how much brighter it is than some of the other finishes in the room. Sutherland Conservation came to the university and did some testing with, you can see all of these different labels. Those are all of the different materials they tested to clean this brickwork. And you can see that most of the cleaners did a really nice job of brightening this brickwork up an incredible amount. So we know that we can really lighten this space up back to its original finish and make it quite a bit more bright and cheerful. This is also a photo from that interior restoration, interior finish investigation. And this is one of our student interns. We love to have students participate in the work that we do. He helped Sutherland Conservation out with peeling away some of their latex finish removers, which was very fun to have our interns involved. And you can see this is kind of the whole composition of those elements that we would like to brighten up. And you can really see how unified all of these elements would have originally been. The brownstone, this is wood here. So this is similar to the original appearance of the wood. This is the way the wood currently appears. And then the brick, which would have had a red wash, would have given it all this very beautiful unified tone. So those are the big things we want to do. The reason the interior finish restoration is so intensive is because the finishes go all the way to the peak of the 40-foot ceiling of the chapel. So we will have to scaffold the whole building in order to do this work. And we do anticipate that it will take about 6 months to scaffold the building, to do all of this finish restoration, and to install all of the new lighting. We'll also be removing the pews from the building and refinishing those. They've been refinished a couple of times before to match all of the wood tones and give a unified appearance to the building. And so that is my spiel. Thank you so much for your interest, and I'm going to hand it over to Woody.
Okay, we've gotten a few questions to start. Brian and Sarita, if you want to come back on, I'm going to ask you a few of these questions to see how many we can get to. And everybody, keep the questions coming on the Q&A. Like I said, we'll get to as many as we can. Brian, Sarita, I'll try to address these to you individually if I can, but otherwise I may just kind of have to ask them and you just kind of have to chime in and try not to interrupt each other. Brian, were there any times during the chapel's history that you know of that the chapel was used for anything that it's no longer being used for today?
I'm not aware of it having been closed or repurposed. I think its role as a sanctuary probably meant that it stayed in business as a place of worship during times when it might have been repurposed, like the Second World War or something like that.
Okay. Thank you. Sarita, you mentioned you were talking for a little bit about the waterproofing system, and you highlighted one of the masons. The work itself, is that being done in-house?
Yeah, so we're really lucky here at the University of Virginia. We have one of the best historic preservation masonry programs probably anywhere in this country. We have all of our own masons. They can't do all of the work here at UVA. They don't do huge projects, but they do love to take on projects like this at the chapel. So yeah, it's all our own UVA masons doing the work.
Great. Who designed the waterproofing system?
SGH out of DC. I can't remember what SGH stands for. I can remember, but it's one of those complicated German names. They are building envelope specialists out of DC.
Have they been involved in any other projects at UVA?
Yeah, absolutely, a lot. They're one of our building envelope on-demand experts, and they did work at the Rotunda. They did provide recommendations for the waterproofing along the East Range for the East Range Stormwater project that we did over the last few years. So we've worked with them quite a bit, and they really understand our preservation ethos.
Probably another question again for Sarita. In regards to water coming in, was it the main culprit a grading issue?
No, not at all. It's really this interaction between this living rock, which is about 3 feet below grade, and the masonry wall. And so, you know, we'd probably get a little bit of water into the basement. Just a masonry foundation like this without waterproofing usually will get a little bit of moisture. But the level of water that we're seeing is really just almost like a stream that pours in between the joint between this living rock ledge and the building foundation. And so it really has more to do with the original construction of the building than the grades.
It's also downhill.
Yeah.
From the rotunda.
It's true.
Where Alderman Library was a big drainage originally. So water has been working in that direction for a long time.
I guess this is a question for either of you. And I just know as we've worked on other buildings around grounds, particularly central grounds in the academical village, things like fire suppression systems aren't always present and certainly not up to date. Where are we with the chapel in terms of, you know, fire alarms, fire suppression?
So we do have a hardwired fire alarm system installed. There's actually the smoke detection system is a laser smoke detection system, like the one that we have in the Rotunda Dome because it's so high up. But we don't have a sprinkler system in the chapel. It would be basically impossible to hide sprinklers in that building, and because it's not a, you know, especially because it's not a residence, it's not as much of a life safety issue.
What kind of wood are the pews?
Pews are oak.
That was an easy one.
Yeah.
The stone for the chapel, where did that come from? Where was that sourced?
It was a gift from a Board of Visitors member from a quarry on his farm, which I think is in one of the nearby counties. So it's a local limestone. Could be as far as the valley, but I think it was a little closer than that.
Okay. We've been getting some questions about the chapel bell. And if I recall, there's been some changes to the Carillon system the last, maybe not that long ago in its long history, but can you talk a little bit about the bell, the history of the bell?
Yeah, the bell was a gift after the chapel was finished, 8 or 10 years after the chapel was finished. And it was given by a group whose name I can't remember right now, that no one can find anything about. They appear a couple of times with their members listed in Corks and Curls, but there's nothing much more than that about who the donors were. It was rung by a rope that came down through the floor of the tower into the room below for many years. In the 1980s, the roof was replaced because of water problems and the bell was deactivated. So all the tolling that you hear now is by the Carillon. The original Carillon was part of the 1950s renovation. It was replaced 10 years ago with a modern electronic one and with new speakers. There were speakers on the roof of Gilmer Hall to repeat the tolling of it at one point. They may still be there. So one of the things we've talked about doing is getting a remote controlled ringer, like a wireless doorbell that would let you push a button and strike the bell so that we could start hearing the bell ring again. But that isn't something we've ever gotten beyond the sort of conversation standpoint, their conversation.
Okay. Is there a graveyard affiliated with the chapel? Obviously, we have the university graveyard on the other side of the grounds, but is there any connection between the two?
No, the university cemetery was opened in 1827 or 1828 when one of the first faculty members' brothers died of typhoid, and it's been going independently since then. Surrounding the chapel was built in what was a pond through much of the 19th century. So there certainly was never a burying ground associated with the chapel.
This is a good question. Do we happen to know who the first bride and groom married in the chapel were? We don't have that record anywhere.
No.
Okay.
I wish.
It's a good question.
That's a really good question.
But we're having trouble even getting 20th century weddings, let alone 19th century ones.
Sarita, with the pine floor being exposed again, taking any precautions to protect it?
Yeah, we'll be finishing it in the same way that we do with all of our historic flooring. So for instance, the pine floors in the rotunda are protected and cleaned and sealed every so often. But also there will remain runners along key pathways throughout the building. So most of the high traffic spots will still have some carpeting down.
Okay. Brian, we've gotten a couple questions about the stained glass windows, and
yes,
you may need to repeat yourself as we've had people come.
Sure.
The nave windows, were they originally plain windows and then in the 1950s replaced over time with gifted stained glass?
They were originally geometric windows, like the windows on the south side of the nave, sort of polychrome hexagonal pieces of glass. And actually the one that was removed in 1978 came back to us about 5 or 6 years ago. It was given to somebody and we got it back. So we have it in storage now, the last of the original nave windows.
Sarita, we've gotten a few questions about HVAC work. Is that very, very interesting, but is that part of the scope as well?
The HVAC system is actually not that old because it's only a one-story building. We have a large basement. The HVAC system is all in the basement of the chapel. We did do duct cleaning and re-insulated the ducts recently, but they're in pretty good condition, and the HVAC system is in pretty good condition. We may look at doing a little bit of conditioning in the basement and or mechanical ventilation in the basement to enhance the waterproofing because it's going to be hard to physically prevent water from entering the basement of that building 100%. So we might do some things downstairs, but nothing in the main part of the building.
Okay. This is a question for either of you. I think it's a really good one. Have you discovered anything interesting or unexpected as work has begun on the chapel?
Well, I think 10 or 12 years ago, when we did the repointing on the tower, we discovered that the mortar in the building was originally a multicolor, that it's a stone-colored mortar that has red stripes applied on all the joints. And it's really very beautiful. And our masons have become quite skilled at recreating the appearance of that. They use straight edges to make the lines neat. So the very random rock gets regularized by all the straight lines that are put in the mortar. And it's a very appealing effect. I think we were very happy to find that there was a historic floor underneath the cork. We didn't know that that was there. We could see little bits of it in the chancel, but there was no sense that it's continued to exist in the rest of the building. So that was a good surprise.
Yeah, when we're crawling around in the crawl space slash basement, we found some interesting things. We found an original chunk of the brownstone that makes up parts of the columns inside the building, and that was really nice to see because it's clean. It's never been stained, and it's never had any of the smoke damage that the rest of the building has. So we could really see how bright and lovely that stone was originally.
Yeah, in terms of cleanliness, I think one of the pleasant surprises was to see how the ceiling is cleaned up, because the ceiling is so dark and almost black now from years of candles and cigarette smoking perhaps and incense, but it was a much lighter, brighter color originally. So what's perceived as a kind of gloomy space, I think once this work is done, will be a much brighter and more inviting space. And that wasn't something that we had really anticipated, just how dramatic the color shift would be on the wooden elements.
Sarita, a couple questions related to lighting in the chapel. What was the original lighting? Was it gas? Was it something else?
So we don't know for sure because there are no plans showing that lighting, and the earliest photo is undated, so we're not even sure how old it is. But it does look like there may have been maybe Brian could help me answer this question.
Yeah. The building was finished just as electric lighting was coming to UVA. We got, I think, electric lights around 1885 or 1888. So it's possible that electric lights were present from the beginning. And at the time, it wasn't uncommon to see a combination fixture with gas lights pointed down and electric lights pointed up. So, I mean, the photograph shows one large bulb hanging from an arch at the west transept. So that may have been it. That may have been a later addition, or it may have been original. It's just not, there's just not evidence. There are heads at the bottom of the arches in the nave, and there's a pipe at the bottom of those heads that clearly was associated with the original lighting. Looks like a gas pipe, but it could have been something like a conduit for an electric light.
Yeah, and the bulb in the photo that we have looks like it's probably an electric fixture, but
yeah,
to Brian's point, that elsewhere, in the chancel, there are places where there's conduit that looks like gas pipe rather than electrical conduit. So
Yeah, behind the big arch at the chancel, there's clearly an arched gas line that maybe fed fixtures that hung from the, would have been pretty dramatic.
So we've got about 2 minutes left for the Q&A, and I just passing through the questions again. I'm guessing we had some people who came in late. Brian, if I may turn to you,
Sure.
Question we get a lot, as you're used to with UVA in architecture, given how different the chapel looks, and the fact that we've got a chapel at UVA, which seems contrary to what Jefferson was looking for. Can you speak a little bit to any kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? Any changes that may have happened that led to the chapel being designed for UVA and built?
Well, I did, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of concern about there not being a chapel even while Jefferson was alive. And Jefferson made provision for church services to take place in the rotunda early on. Through the course of the 19th century, I think that there was an increasing emphasis on church services, formalizing the church services in the community and in the nation at large. And the distinction that Jefferson was creating as this being a secular school solely faded in importance in a lot of cases. And I think the chapel came to be an expected amenity at the school, something that parents expected to have available to their children. It was always, it's a non-denominational chapel. There were chaplains here, but they rotated through several approved Protestant denominations, usually stayed 3 to 5 years. Around the time that they enclosed the south wing for to be the chapel, south wing of the rotunda to be the chapel, they built a parsonage, which you would now know as number 4 Dawson's Row, the Office of African American Affairs. So in the mid 1840s, there was a parsonage constructed. So pretty early in the school's history, there was a somewhat formal role for the chapel and for a chaplain.
Great. Well, thanks for tackling that question. I know a lot for a lot of different parts of UVA. Brian and Sarita, thank you again for joining us for the presentation, for answering a lot of different questions about this project. I know this is one you two are very passionate about getting started on, and so excited so many people share your passion for this space. So again, thank you.
All right.
So now we're going to invite on a pair of couples who were married at the chapel, Emily and Mark Carroll. Emily is a 2002 graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, and Kanetta and Tim Adkins in Atlanta. Kanetta is a 2006 college grad, and Tim is a 2006 engineering grad. And before I forget, Emily and Mark are in Crozet. Welcome, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
As I mentioned early on, Tim and Kanetta are in Atlanta, 2006 grads. Emily and Mark are in Crozet. Emily is a 2002 grad. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to ask these guys a couple different questions. Emily and Mark, can you tell us a little bit about how you met?
Well, I was at the time in law school in Pennsylvania, and came down to the DC area to meet up with a bunch of my UVA friends, actually, and go out for an evening. And we met at a bar. Very romantic.
Tim and Kanetta, same question.
So we actually met at UVA. We met as friends in Tuttle Lounge. which is over in
R.I.P. Tuttle Lounge.
yeah, so it's no longer there. We had some great memories in Tuttle. So we met there. I think it may have been the second or third weekend of our first year. And then we were friends all throughout the 4 years at UVA. And we actually didn't become together like a couple until like 2005. So we graduated in 2006. So it was a year before we graduated before we actually became official.
Long courtship. I like that. Tim and Kaneda, when were you married and what do you remember most about that day?
So we were married April 9th, 2017. And I think what we remember most is just like the day came together perfectly. I mean, weather was great. We actually had our wedding the Sunday of an alumni weekend. So our guest list, everybody was pretty much already there. And things just flowed together so well. I mean, the chapel was great. The turnout for our wedding was great. I mean, we went over to the rotunda and took a photo afterwards with our entire guest list and everybody that was at our wedding. And I mean, everything was just perfect in terms of weather, turnout. I mean, we had a good time.
Emily and Mark, same question.
We were married on May 9th of 2009, and that was Mother's Day weekend. So I remember there was all the festivities of the wedding on Saturday, and then Sunday we turned around and had brunch for all the moms. It was very similar though, beautiful weather, it all came together, and we did the same thing. We had all of our guests get on the steps of the rotunda so we could get a group picture right after the ceremony and have beautiful pictures from being on grounds and on the lawn right after the ceremony.
And they were calling for rain all day long, and it was quite a nice surprise for it to be hot and sunny.
Yeah.
That's very true because every reunion weekend, we usually always have to prepare for rain. So that Sunday, it was probably like 75 and sunny all day.
Yeah.
So
Perfect.
Emily, given that you're the only UVA grad out of the two of you, how did you convince Mark that it's really important to get married at the UVA chapel?
It was a struggle on many levels. He's a Hokie.
Don't hold that, please.
And I grew up in Blacksburg and my parents are Hokies. So I took a lot of convincing.
Boy.
But he had accepted a job at UVA. So we knew he was moving down here, and I really pushed for a Charlottesville wedding. And it worked out well because it was centrally located. His family was 2 hours north, mine was 2 hours west, and Charlottesville was sort of in the middle. So it worked out for all of us.
What's the option? Where do you get married at Virginia Tech? Is it just the drill field?
They have a chapel, but
Yeah,
it's buried in the ground.
Oh my God. Kaneda and Tim, what was so special about getting married at the UVA chapel for you?
oh gosh, I think it was just more of a knowing one, we didn't have to do any decorations inside the chapel. So we saved a lot of money because we did 0 decorations in there just because the chapel stands alone, both outside and inside. So we saved a lot of money there. But just the lighting in the chapel, although it's going to be enhanced, but we felt as if it added a little bit of intimacy to our ceremony just because it was a little bit dark. And that was a really nice architectural feature. And what do you think?
And I think the chapel, I mean, we had been to the chapel several times for other events at UVA. And I think it was just with all of our friends already being at UVA, I feel like it was just a very UVA central piece that kind of really just tied off how our relationship started really well. So
yeah, it just made sense.
Yeah.
That's great. Were there any other architectural elements or parts of the chapel that are your favorite or that kind of burned into your memory?
So I loved the arches and just like that feel and look. Like Kaneda said, you really didn't have to do much of any decoration because the chapel itself stands out alone. The acoustics, we had some folks sing at our wedding. The acoustics were great. We had an organist there. I mean, just the whole look of the interior, even with the lighting a little dimmer, again, it made for some intimacy in the chapel as well. And so I feel like the interior architecture which is perfect for an intimate setting. And then, of course, the bell tower is always a nice added piece outside. So.
Yeah. The summer before my 4th year, I played quite a few weddings at the chapel that I was staying in Charlottesville that summer. Made a lot of good beer money that way. So I say that to go back to talk about the acoustics. It really rings in there.
Yeah.
Emily and Mark, any special part of the chapel that you remember, or any particular architectural element that's your favorite?
I would probably say, I guess I would echo Tim's sentiments. I mean, the whole building is
Is that a
beautiful.
pun?
I'm sorry?
Was that a pun?
It was.
Yeah, I guess.
Echo the part about the acoustics.
Yeah, sure. Let's go with it. Yeah, no, it's I mean, I the vaulted ceilings, especially, you know, it kind of draws your focus upwards, and the stained glass windows. You know, it's kind of dark in there, but the way it lets in light really makes that, you know, interior really beautiful.
I always love the outside. The bell tower being asymmetric and off center like that, I just feel like it stands out and makes it unique. And I didn't get to do a lot of drawing classes in college, but I took one. And I remember whenever I could get my sketchbook and sneak over to that side, I would like to sit on the benches and like draw the trees and the stonework. So I always just visually found it very appealing, just walking around that part of grounds.
Yeah. The bell tower definitely stands out.
Yeah. Well, Tim, Canetta, Emily, and Mark, thank you again so much for joining us. Really, it's being able to hear about your special days, you know, kind of reminds us with Valentine's Day coming up, you know, how special the chapel is, not just as a historic building at UVA, but you know, like many parts of UVA in the building, it's where a lot of special memories are made. So thank you again so much for sharing a little bit about your special day and for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
And again, thank you to our speakers, Brian and Sarita. I will say I saw a bunch of questions about funding for the project. The interior of the project is projected to be between $2 and $3 million. And getting so many questions about funding sources and costs as a UVA really got to me. That really warms my heart. We will be looking at fundraising for this project, and you can believe we will be in touch with everybody about opportunities to participate down the road once we get a little bit closer to the project. Now we are going to move back to the photo montage from earlier. So that's going to start playing after I finish my spiel. Feel free to stay on and watch the entire thing. Thank you again for submitting all those wonderful photos. Thank you all for joining this evening. Happy Valentine's Day, and go Who's.